Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you all had a nice lunch. My name is Andrew Wilson. I'll be chairing the session on politics till 3:45, maybe 3:40, 50. We have three presentations. First, we have a joint presentation by Jakub Blicharski and Jakub Misztal, both from Krakow, from the University of Economics, entitled The Duality of Belarus's Digital Transformation Between the State's Industry 4.0 Strategy and the Internationalisation of Free Commerce, must be a typo, and IT Sector Under Sanctions. Jakub and Jakub, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introducing us. So my name is Jakub Blicharski, and as we were introduced, we are representing the Krakow University of Economics. And today in our presentation, we are going to dive into the duality of Belarus digital transformation. Specifically, we're going to analyze briefly analyze the relations with the European Union and Russia. Then we'll briefly cover the aspects of Belarusian diaspora. Then we'll talk shortly about the origins of the development of the ICT sector in Belarus. Then we'll briefly go through research objectives and methodology. After that, we'll also present our results and also present our conclusions as well as limitations. So we are hoping for questions later in the discussion part. But first, if we want to talk about the duality of digital transformation, we need to cover the context of the geopolitical context. First, Belarus-Russian relations. It is observed that after 1994, Belarus was seeking closer relations with Russia, which wanted to keep its influence in Belarus after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The literature suggests that at that time, when Russia's position was much weaker than nowadays, Alexander Lukashenko had personal political ambitions, including probably even becoming a president of Russia. Hence, in 1999, just before the Putin came to power, both Alexander Lukashenko and Boris Yeltsin signed the Treaty on the Creation of the Union State. However, as we know, the project of the Union State between Russia and Belarus has never been fully materialized. Kremlin saw the Union State as the possibility to keep political influence in Belarus, while Lukashenko saw the Union State as the opportunity for access of Belarusian goods to Russian market, as well as he viewed the opportunity for that Belarusians would pay the same prices for oil as Russians in the regions. Lukashenko also viewed the Union State as ability to keep power and position while maintaining the sovereignty of Belarus and autonomy. As we know, there were voices of concern about potential loss of Belarusian sovereignty that were especially manifested after the Georgian War in 2008, the annexation of Crimea and Donbas in 2014, and after the start of full-scale war in Ukraine 4 years ago. It is also worth noting that thanks to Russian energy subsidies, Belarus could save nearly $5 billion, or 15% of its GDP between 2000 and 2008. 90% of heat and electric energy is produced from Russian gas, and since 2011, Gazprom controls whole Belarusian oil and gas infrastructure, which led Alachnovich and other scholars to believe that in 2020, Belarus was paying more for gas than the average European buyer, although oil remained 50% below market value. And even greater dependence on Russia was observed after 2020 and 2022, up to the point that Russia accounted for almost 90% of Belarusian trade. On the other side, on the other hand, we have Belarus relations with European Union. Since the very beginning of Belarus independence and after the fall of the Curtain, the European communities and EU and later EU called for the democratization of Central and Eastern European countries, which was also viewed by the signing of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and Belarus back in 1995. Hence the photo that is being shown currently on the slide. The PCA agreement was also followed by the signing of the interim agreement in 1996. However, after the constitutional referendum, which expanded the presidential privileges, there were several concerns about Lukashenko's style of governance, which led Tadeusz Kubin to state that Belarus effectively became an authoritarian state by the end of 1996. There were violations of human rights, lack of respect for fundamental freedoms, and as a result, in 1997, the EU froze the ratification of PCA and interim agreements. Later, first restrictions came, including the ban on Lukashenko's entry to the EU, as well as first sanctions in September 2004, then in December 2004, then in March and May 2006. By the time, even though there were short periods of rapprochement with the EU, first in 2009 and 2010, when sanctions were partially suspended, these periods were brutally ended after the elections. For example, in December 2010, which led the EU to another reintroduction of sanctions. Then, another rapprochement came between 2014 and 2020 when Belarus did not recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea, and as a result, EU started to lift most of sanctions. In the meantime, Lukashenko liberalized the visa policy and even promoted the soft Belarusian policy, including unofficially supporting, or at least not repressing, the anniversaries that were more related to Belarusian history rather than the common Soviet history, or Russian history to be more precise. On 1st July 2020, the agreement on visa facilitation and readmission negotiated between the EU and Belarus came into force. However, just a month later, as we all know, the anti-regime protests that were the results of the presidential elections were brutally suppressed, and it is believed that the support of Russian secret services, or FSB, helped Lukashenko stay in power, but at the cost of greater Belarusian dependence on Russia and deeper integration with this country. Opposition leaders were forced into exile. The election results were not accepted by the EU, and as a consequence, new sanctions, including the economic sectoral sanctions, have been imposed on Belarus and Belarusian companies. Since the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, when Belarus allied itself with Russia, Belarus was regarded as a co-aggressor state, which led the EU to synchronize its sanctions policy with the sanctions policy against Russia. Even though Belarus became more dependent on Russia, there were attempts to establish relations with different countries. For example, People's Republic of China, the countries of the BRICS group, the countries from Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or also from Africa or even Latin America. However, Belarus was becoming viewed effectively as not only an unreliable international actor, but one lacking any real alternative in the conduct of its foreign policy. This is the geopolitical context. Now we need to cover the context of Belarusian diaspora. Even though there was a steady outflow of Belarusian citizens before 2020, especially towards Russia and other European states, we need to consider that between 300 and up to 500,000 Belarusians were forced to flee Belarus after elections in August 2020. Especially young IT professionals were seeking higher political freedom and higher salaries. Poland and Lithuania, in the meantime, became key destinations for Belarusian immigration. Although there were also some Belarusians that migrated to Ukraine, but after the full-scale war, some of them were forced to flee again, this time from Ukraine. Polish business, there were also some programs supporting the Belarusian migrants, such as Polish Business Harbor program, which is an example of a program targeted to Belarusians with an engineering degree and experience in the IT sector. Approximately more than 84,000 PBH visas were issued. After 2022, Belarusians still migrate to EU despite difficulties, but some chose to migrate either to Georgia, Armenia, or even Kazakhstan. As in one of the reports, we can actually find estimates that there are currently more than 9,000 businesses and at least 20,000 sole proprietorships registered in the EU by Belarusians, and three quarter of them, or 73%, were registered in the period after 2020. The majority of them is registered in Poland, and also 16% of companies are registered in the Baltic states. IT specialists became a significant part of the sole proprietorships, but this part will be covered by my colleague. Kuba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The development of the ICT sector in Belarus began in 2005 with the establishment of the High Technology Park. Another turning point came in 2017 when a presidential decree established numerous tax breaks and exemptions for IT companies and specialists. The liberal policies in this authoritarian state were designed to attract foreign investors. Another significant event was the unrest sparked by the 2020 presidential election, in which the ICT sector played a significant role. However, problems intensified in 2022 due to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. At that time, the West made the decision clear: reallocation or termination of cooperation. Please, next slide. Since the events of 2020, the government has been using digital tools to surveil and indoctrinate society. This represents a reversal of the previous paradoxical digital sovereignty in the ICT sector. Moreover, Belarus increased dependence on Russia after 2020 has proven to be a remedy for the economic collapse associated with the withdrawal of foreign investors and companies and the draining of resources. At the same time, the literature on the subject points out that Belarus is beginning to become a client state of Russia. Next slide, please. Researchers propose various approaches to this situation. One proposed by Rust assumes two scenarios. First, maintaining a sanction by the West and an isolating approach towards Belarus, resulting in the official transformation of Belarus into a puppet state, or a partial lifting of sanction in exchange for humanitarian concession from Belarus and the establishment of democratic dialogue. Each of these paths carries political risks. However, attention should be paid to the action taken towards the Belarusian diaspora by host countries, which benefit from accepting Belarusian migrants from the ICT sector. These countries should implement special policies for this group, such as language support or improved visa access, etc. Next slide, please. But what really influenced the development of the ICT sector in Belarus between 2005 and 2017, primarily high quality technology education, generous wages, tax breaks, and minimal state administrative control. Next slide, please.
So we are going to, in our research, we want to present and describe the phenomenon of dualism in the country's digital transformation process. As for that, we've decided our research is desk research method. We want to focus on data from World Bank, the Baroque Center, also the state statistics from Belstat, and also the statistics from World Intellectual Property Organizations. And we will cover some of the indicators that are shown on the slide. However, and we will also present the characteristics of ICT sector.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I showed in the previous, the value of one second, please. The value of ICT sector exports has been increasing for years, and just before unrest in Belarus, the sector employed approximately 85,000 people. Subsequently, as a result of the protest in 2020, 20,000 people emigrated. These losses were quickly compensated, but in 2022, another wave of specialist outlaw occurred. 23,000 people left the country, representing nearly 20% of the entire sector. In 2024, 60,000 IT specialists were recorded. Please, next slide.
Jakub and Jakub, you have 2 minutes.
Another consequences of Russia aggression against Ukraine is the Belarusian digital brain drain. Most of those people migrate to European Union countries, especially Poland and Lithuania. Poland is an interesting case due to the now inactive but still functioning Poland business harbor. Thanks to this program, as much as 7% of the ICT sector reallocated to Poland. During this period, many Belarusian companies left the country and forecast most often assume stagnation of the ICT sector. So maybe next slide. And next slide. Let's look at data. The charts show us impressive increase in the share of ICT services in Belarus total exports from 3.7% in 2015 to a peak of 8.2% in 2020. This sector has become a key supplier of hard currency. However, in 2021, we see a decline to 7.5%. The value of export in 2021 amounted to $3.8 billion, which accounted for 5.5% of the country GDP. Next slide. Innovation data confirms the crisis. The number of patent applications has fallen from over 630 per year between 2016 and 2018 to just 400 in 2024. Research and development spending as a percentage of GDP remains low, hovering around 0.5, 0.6%. Maybe next slide. Belarus' position in the Global Innovation Index fell from 72nd place in 2021 to 18th in 2024. The ICT sector's share of GDP which had been growing continuously since 2013, reaching 7.5%, fell sharply to 5.4% in 2024. Maybe next slide. Maybe next slide. The e-commerce market in Belarus is dominated by Russian players. The top 5 largest marketplaces include Wildberries, Ozon, and Yandex, and AliExpress and Deal.Buy. E-commerce share of retail sales is 6%. Next slide. Lukashenko policies have led to the exhaustion of the state's unique model of cooperation with the IT sector, ending dreams of Belarusian Silicon Valley. Key turning points in 2020 and 2022 triggered the mass emigration of business leaders and the dispersal of valuable intellectual capital across European Union countries. Currently, the sector's development is hampered by brain drain and a lack of access to Western technologies, forcing the economy into a desperate and risky dependence of Russia and China. Consequently, despite initial success, the future of digital transformation in Belarus remains uncertain and depends on survival in isolation from the West. Maybe next slide, and next slide. So we primarily recommend conducting advanced statistical analysis or qualitative studies, in-depth studies that address the long-term effects of brain drain and verify whether Russian and Chinese infrastructure and technologies actually compensate for the disconnect from Western models, may be worth considering. So thank you very much for your attention.
And we'll be very pleased to answer the questions in the discussion session.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jakub and Jakub. Thank you for speeding up towards the end. 20 minutes each. Our second presenter is Midiã Cavalcante from the Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil, who will also be presenting online on Black Nights and the Limits of Democratic Sanctions, Evidence from Belarus. Midiã, are you there?
Today, earlier.
Don't think anybody. She was registered online, not in person.
Okay.
That might mean a lot of time for you.
Well, I won't take more than 3 minutes.
So we need the slides, right?
Yeah.
So we're assuming she's not there. He or she's not there. So we move on to our third speaker, Alexei Lalo, who is from North Carolina State University in the US. And we'll talk on disenchantment and charismatic authority in the context of the 2020 process in Belarus.
Well, that's,
Alexei.
yeah, hi. Thank you. Mark. I have a roll out notes, so is that okay? I still need it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
all right,
people are
okay.
recording as well.
Okay. Should I hold it in my hand?
You can attach it.
Okay. Where were you, please say? How do you attach it? Oh, I got it. All right, so I have a little bit a different title. I went in a different direction a little bit. So it's called, where's my, okay. Continue to share.
Yes.
Okay, I just need to the beginning, yeah. All right, so insufficient charisma and symbolic self-sacrifice, the phenomenon of Tikhanovsky in juxtaposition to other prominent anti-Putin post-communist leaders. So this talk aims to make some generalizations about the 4 most significant charismatic politicians of the former Soviet Union's newly independent states who managed to challenge the colonialist authority of Moscow. Mikhail Saakashvili of Georgia, the Revolution of the Roses, Yulia Tymoshenko of Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, Alexei Navalny of Russia, the Bolotnaya protest and subsequent self-sacrifice, and with a special focus on Sergei Tikhanovsky of Belarus, the 2020 upheaval. If we consider the post-communist social space within Max Weber's concepts of charisma, authority, sacrifice, and routinization of charisma, these four individuals have been able to rely on their uncanny, supernatural ability to appeal, again, supernatural is in quotes, it's Weber's term, to appeal to the masses in their respective nations, but eventually their adepts or followers were all unable to routinize their charismas. As a result, their projects have been largely unsuccessful and entailed only symbolic positive outcomes. So a more formal argument is that in post-communist hybrid regimes characterized by incomplete legal rational institutionalization, charismatic challenges emerge as moral prophetic figures whose authority is grounded in perceived self-sacrifice. However, structural constraints prevent routinization of charisma into durable institutions, leading to symbolic rather than institutional victories. It may also be hypothesized that their charismas were insufficient. With this in mind, I will briefly consider all the four Weberian definitions of charisma to see if they all fit these leaders. For the lack of time or space, obviously, I'll only focus on Sergei Tikhanovsky. It will be argued that essentially all the four individuals' charismatic appeal was predicated upon their altruistic political martyrdom and largely symbolic, ineffective self-sacrifice. With varying degrees of success, they countered Putin-style self-indulgence and hedonism of their respective opponents with giving up their own welfare, health, and even life for the benefit of their respective nations' democratic growth. While most of their efforts failed to lead to lasting institutional changes with varying degrees. From a moral perspective, these charismatic leaders provided their nations with an ethical compass, and their contributions will be useful to their possible successors as these nations try to find their way through the dark years of repressive autocratic regimes. Their symbolic victories will arguably serve as a role model type of example for future charismatic leaders who will have the opportunity to learn from their predecessors' mistakes and miscalculations. Finally, I will touch upon possible reasons as to why their charismas were not were not routinized, and their successes was largely merely symbolic and entailed no institutional change, especially in such countries as Russia and Belarus, but also increasingly Georgia. It will be claimed that Emil Durkheim's theory of anomie in relationship to governmental and moral authorities, as well as the concept of managed anomie, can be applied to these cases in such unique environments as post-communist Belarus. Nevertheless, these cases of martyrdom can also be described as moral success stories and victories. They literally awakened some parts of their respective societies from slumber. In this comparative framework, I'll specifically dwell on Tikhanovsky, who is justifiably credited for the scare the Belarus protests of 2020 gave to both Lukashenko's and Putin's regimes. His charismatic authority was built in 2019-20 via appealing not to Minsk and big-town office plankton, but to rural and small-town population. His strategy, for the better or worse, was also devoid of relying on national Belarusian symbols such as the national language, emblem, and flag. The appeal of his spouse, Svetlana, who managed to become the opposition leader since, was also based on her similar charismatic qualities, appreciated by rural and small-town women who felt empowered and enchanted, quote unquote, by her courage and devotion to her family. It will be argued that this example has to be studied very thoroughly, as it could point to a path for a more successful democratic post-Lukashenko transition. Belarus, once likened to a French Republic's Levante by Ales Adamovich, could still prove to be the black swan Putin and his ilk are so wary of in the post-Soviet space. The logic of it is very simple. The Vendée actually, oh, I'm sorry. Why is this? Why is it lagging behind? I have this here and it's not. Sorry. Well, it's okay. I can just, yeah.
Now something is happening.
All right, let me.
Maybe don't make it full screen.
Or maybe don't make it full screen, yeah. Can I do the next one? How do I do the next one? Oh, okay, got it. Okay, so the logic of it is very simple. The Vendée can never be more democratic than Paris. In other words, if Minsk becomes suddenly a democracy as a reversal of the Vendée rebellion in 1793-96, the Kremlin will no longer be able to sustain itself as a regional neo-imperialistic hub. Tikhanovsky has arguably been able to intuit this Achilles heel of the regime, and his successors need to follow suit. This is potentially the most important moral and symbolic contribution of such charismatic figures to a would-be democratization of Belarus. Most of the extant research on Belarusian 20 protests focuses on applied sociology and political science tools and methods, highlighting the role of external factors such as the threat of Russia and Western assistance. But I propose a more balanced theoretical framework in which all these post-communist societies are seen as sharing certain common characteristics and cultural predicaments. So first, let's consider very briefly where is the, oh yeah, sorry. The four, sorry for the small font, four operationalized definitions of charisma. So, and apply those to the case of Tikhanovsky, obviously, in 20. So, number one, behavioral cues model that includes presence, power, and warmth. Charisma is operationalized as the ability to project a combination of high-level presence, etc., etc. This leader's reliance on very simple symbols and goals, such as the anti-corruption and anti-bureaucracy sentiment, such as "Страна для жизни," and on YouTube interviews with small-town and rural residents, was a rather successful strategy. One can surmise that this definition largely fits the activities of this leader. His collaboration with Nechta, for instance, resulted in a joint recording of the well-known anthem of protest, The Walls, Muri, that clearly had a great mobilizing effect on the active part of the population. However, it was difficult for this leader to maintain a high-level presence in Belarusian media, as he only had YouTube and Telegram at his disposal. He had no access to television and other media, so as we all know. Second, the social skills model, expressivity, sensitivity, control. So emotional expressivity, emotional sensitivity, etc., etc. Without dwelling too deeply on this, I will only note that this leader struck the right note when he relied on highly emotional and spot-on images, such as the famous comparison of the Belarusian leader with a cockroach, and offering a slipper to his supporters to crush the insect with it. However, his popularity in big urban areas such as Minsk or Gomel was limited. It was a mistake not to target these decisive urban centers, but it was probably done largely to security concerns, such as the fear of being detained. And number three, leadership transformational model, vision, impact, conviction. So here I say that this is where this project was arguably at its weakest and has not met the criteria, the Weber criteria. The vision for Страна для жизни lacked cohesiveness and did not put on the table any tangible, clearly formulated goals of a post-Lukashenko transition. Mistakes were made, such as flirting with Russia and visiting the Crimea a few years before. There was no economic or political program associated with this movement, as it relied primarily on the loyalty of a network of smaller YouTube bloggers. And finally, number four, the charisma is defined, the four-type model, specific actionable style an individual uses to influence others, authority, focus, visionary, whatever, kindness. So here some significant correlation can be found. Most importantly, this leader was able to attentively listen and hear his interviewees on his YouTube channel, which helped foster functional feedback mechanisms. But overall, his authority was not fully recognized by the population, who are susceptible to propaganda and at the same time profoundly suspicious of all authority in this post-Soviet space affected by anomie. So, as one can see, none of these models fully fit with this case. We can surmise that this case can only be described as that of an insufficient charisma. Finally, let's consider why this leader's Belarusian protests were unable to achieve tangible results, despite his self-sacrifice. Writing about the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, Prozorov notes that the invasion the Russian invasion of Georgia. It was the first case of violation by Russia of the legitimacy of the post-Soviet boundaries established by the Belarusian treaties of December 1991. Initially, Yeltsin's Russia acted as a restraining force in the post-Soviet space, but under Putin, the 2008 war has plunged, it's a quote, the post-Soviet space into the condition of anomie. It is well known and well documented that post-communist society, especially in Russia and Belarus, were affected by profound state of anomie, a Durkheimian concept of normlessness and institutional failure in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. While Belarus did not experience the criminal bespredel that Russia did, the main shared feature was the loss of Soviet cultural values and norms without acquiring any other value system in its stead. Some scholars have introduced the concept of a management of anomie by the ruling regime to maintain stability. It has been claimed that in countries like Russia, authority is now preserved not by eliminating anomie, but by managing its prolonged existence via implementing what is called exceptional measures to foster a state of exception that has turned into the new norm. We remember the ideological cliches that I have on the screen of early Putinism, such as Surkov and Chubaisy's concept of sovereign democracy, that harks back, among other things, to Shatov's God-bearing people in Dostoevsky's Demons. Yeah, that's Shatov there, but I think it's incorrect. He used to speak like this. He pointed with his finger up, not like this. Anyway, it's not a good picture. So, one can also recall Lukashenko's constant reliance on some kind of Belarusian exceptionalism, such as "Время выбрало нас." I just have a quote there, but I have no time for that. So, other anachronistic terms, such as, and heinous terms, such as dictatorship, pятилетка, comrade president, and the like, that have all acquired a glowingly positive connotation. In other words, any attempted establishment of charismatic authority in this space is hampered by an a priori mistrust of authority by the population. In these circumstances, sacrifice of one's life, such as Alexei Navalny's, can be seen as a political miscalculation. This leader has not been sufficiently charismatic and popular, and his self-sacrifice was therefore largely symbolic. Even though Tikhanovsky's case is quite different, one can observe that he and his adherents have largely lost the battle with the regime's machine of propaganda, violence, and coercion. Maybe it was not their fault, but their mistake, but to a large extent, it was a logical outcome of their inability to function in this space of managed anomie. In the aftermath of the 22 invasion of Ukraine, Lukashenko's ratings of approval have reportedly gone up from 15-20 to 33-35%, as a lot of Belarusians, especially in southern regions of Gomel and Brest, perceive his regime as the only guarantor of independence and peace. One can register, for instance, anecdotal evidence that the same people who risked their livelihood to take part in the 20 peaceful protests argue today that Lukashenko is a unique leader who can be trusted, who is the only one capable of political zigzagging, сможет пропетлять his way through the situation with the war in Ukraine. This signifies that a new charismatic leader will have to employ different tools to be able to lead the masses and task herself with attempting to dismantle the state of managed anomie at both ideological and practical levels. So then I repeat the conclusions. And finally, do I have 1 minute? One more minute. Yeah. So as a bonus, I'll draw a brief comparison of Putin and Lukashenko. That we all know, but just very briefly. So a brief comparison of Putin and Lukashenko's tenures can provide an additional angle for my arguments here. It's important to know the contrasting trajectories of charismatic perception in the incumbent regimes. Vladimir Putin initially appeared in the late 90s and early 2000s as a figure of relatively low personal charisma in the Weberian sense, technocratic, restrained, and even colorless in public demeanor. However, over time, his image was deliberately reconstructed through state-controlled media into a form of manufactured performative charisma grounded in strength, control, and geopolitical assertiveness. By contrast, Alexander Lukashenko began his rule with a comparatively high level of popular charisma, I have some slides here, but it's not important. A high level of popular charisma rooted in his populist rhetoric, direct communication style, and identification with rural and Soviet nostalgic constituencies. Yet, this initially robust charismatic appeal has gradually eroded, giving way to a more coercive and bureaucratized form of authority, especially after the 2020 protests. These inverse trajectories, Putin's transition from low to constructed charisma, and Lukashenko's decline from high to fading charisma, further illustrate the instability and non-routinized nature of charismatic authority in post-Soviet hybrid regimes. This comparison thus illustrates the utmost complexity of the challenges facing new charismatic leader of the future who will follow in the footsteps of such leaders as Navalny or Tikhanovsky. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei. The absence of the speaker on us at the time, possibly Jakub and Jakub to go back over some of the bits they speeded over at the end of their presentation, perhaps in answer to questions. I'll check on online questions shortly, but the floor is open to any questions from the room. Gentleman there. We're recording, so if you can wait for that. Mike.
Yeah, hi, I'm Pavel Shevtsov, a trustee of the Belarusian Library in London. Thank you to the speakers for a very interesting presentation. Question to Alexei. Charismatic leaders obviously is a big risk from a voter perspective. How do you distinguish between somebody who's there to lead us to sign affluence and those who are there to line up their pockets or become another dictator, so essentially to slay a dragon to become a new dragon? So how, as voter, when you're looking at a sort of charismatic young leader, you know, him or her, how would you say, well, this is a good guy and this is not?
It's an interesting question. I think when we see people sacrificing themselves and putting their health on the line and putting their lives on the line, I think we can trust them that they will not line their pockets. You know, Nelson Mandela didn't line his pockets. So, of course, many of these leaders have been accused of corruption themselves, right? Including Tymoshenko, including Navalny, etc. And I'm not denying it that they have never done anything wrong. We all have. I have. We all have. Especially in the 1990s in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. We all have. So, but I think we can trust them because they have shown that they can sacrifice themselves. All the four of them that I mentioned, and you know, I think that's what I meant when I said that they kind of they oppose their Putin style and his group style of lining their pockets, of enriching themselves. So I think we could trust maybe not these leaders anymore, but their followers. You know, those who will follow in their steps, because we know the situation with these leaders. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding masculinities that are presented, because I think that the conversation about public image and charisma cannot be fulfilled without talking about charismatic and the fatherhood connotation. And I think that in the argument that at least Belarusian young men are not dying on the field, on the battlefield, is very prevalent when we are talking about the kind of transformation of the image. So I'm wondering, what are you thinking about this type of masculinity and its transformation within time, and especially after 2022? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I haven't thought about it, but from the top of my head, since I'm a former sexuality expert and gender expert, I can say that both Russian and Belarusian masculinity is, I don't think they're quite ready. And what we saw in Belarus in 20, and I saw it with my own eyes for the whole thing, was that the women can and should be taking the upper hand. And I think Tymoshenko was the first example in the former post-Soviet space who showed that after Yushchenko was poisoned, especially in 2004, so that she could lead single-handedly and that she could lead her nation to success. And I think that's a very whatever we think of her, that's a very symbolic, very important symbolic example. That is further illustrated by the fact that when she was in that hospital facility in Kharkiv, famously, Yanukovych and his people watched her on the TV and laughed and drank and laughed, watched her, on this hidden camera. So, I mean, the importance of this self-sacrifice is huge. And I think that these three Belarusian women, they followed kind of this. And, but unfortunately, it only happened because of the fact that Svetlana was allowed to run. So I think in future though, the importance of womanhood, the importance of femininity in these countries is huge, and it's underestimated by researchers. And if you can think abstractly and if you can think critically about what's been happening the last 20-25 years, you should notice that women are, you can include also the former Georgian president here, etc., etc. So women in Armenia as well, women are of an increasing importance. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's just some thoughts from the top of my head.
I have a question for Jakub and Jakub. In your presentation, you showed that the share of ICT in GDP has fallen, but not as far as one might think since 2020, down from 7.5% to 5.4%. Why is that? Is that because the exodus of native Belarusian specialists to Poland and elsewhere has been offset by incoming Chinese and Russian technology? If so, what is it, and is it commercially active? We hear a lot about Russian, to some extent Chinese digital propaganda playing a much bigger role in Belarus since 2020. Is that part of the figures as well?
So, from what we haven't, to be honest, we haven't looked at this matter from that perspective. So this might be also another part of future research. But while I was preparing while I was conducting and looking for the data about the GDP, I found that the first exodus of IT professionals in 2020 or 2021, the outflow of these IT professionals was compensated by the inflow of either freshly graduated IT specialists or those who started working in IT. So that might be also provide one of the explanations why the IT sector was still playing significant role in 2021. However, after when Belarus allied itself with Russia a year later, some of the Belarusian IT companies, or the ones that were, or the foreign companies that were operating in Belarus, had to simply choose either they were going to still conduct the operations and risk being under the sanctions list, or to move the its headquarters from Belarus to other countries, and that's also what happened. Some of the companies that were operating in Belarus were had to move out. I believe that one of the examples was EPAN Systems, so one of the oldest IT companies and one of the oldest companies from the from the Central and Eastern Europe that is that is a part of the Nasdaq or NICE 500 index. Apologies if I get that wrong, but one of the companies that was noted on the New York stock market. I believe that also the coming or replacing the, let's call them Western companies with companies from Russia and China. So the companies that emerged as somewhat the allies of Belarusian economy, Belarusian regime could probably be an answer for that. But we haven't looked at it. We haven't looked at it. And if you could, Jakub, you have also something to add, please please do it.
I can add only that we believe the initial decline in the ICT sector in 2020 was a result of the protest in 2020. However, Belarus tried to compensate for the losses with new employees and strengthened ties with Russia. Russia also began establishing research and development centers in the Belarus, but until 2022 and the sanction that the sector faced a significant blow. However, due to restriction on data publication after 2022, we had difficult accessing data after 2021, which is one of the research limitation in our research topic.
Thank you, Jakub. Lady at the front, I'll just check on any online questions. Okay. Do you want to ask yours? And then please ask me.
Shall I? Oh, hello. Well, I know that after the invasion of Ukraine, Poland had over 1% of economic growth in their GDP. And now it's the champion in the European family in its economic growth in GDP, and it has the IT sector has the largest growth rates, about 80% or something like that. So my question is, do you have some information whether Ukrainian or Belarusian sector, because I understand that there is a majority of people who immigrated to Poland that's from IT sector from the Ukraine, but anyway, do you have some information? What is the share they contributed to this incremental growth, about 80% per year? So that's a growth. It's a very good thing, very good indices. Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we haven't come to that to this data.
If you could just wait a second, there's another question.
Yeah, my question to Alexei. I was wondering, in all this, repertoire of concept you used, for me, somehow populism was not really prominent, and which is probably would be quite appropriate when you talk about Lukashenko's rise to power, right? The populist rhetoric, because in comparison to charisma, it's kind of a little bit easier to catch and grasp and describe and define and kind of fill in with the content. So I was wondering if it played any role, because it's also part of the reason I think it's important, because populism, obviously, it's a kind of relational concept, because it's not just what has been said, but also it's very much oriented towards the audience, right?
What is the
relational concept? Because it's been articulated in response to some expectation, right? So it's in relation of specific societal context, right? And society has changed enormously in Belarus, right? 94 and let's say 2020.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, maybe it could be kind of something to consider to count into this, description.
So different questions to different panelists. Jakub and Jakub, if you could start by answering the question about Belarusian contribution to Polish economic growth.
Unfortunately, we couldn't find the data. Probably there might be. If we were to talk about, for example, Ukrainian GDP, there have been some data, some publications suggesting that even before the 2022, the Ukrainian migration accounted for either between 0.5% or even additional growth of GDP by even 2.4 percentage points. And probably this amount has even become larger after the influx of Ukrainian migrants. Unfortunately, the research on Belarusian input towards the Polish GDP is probably very limited. Some publications about the perception of Belarusian diaspora has been conducted by the Mieroszewski Center, by the Polish Mieroszewski Center, which is one of the research institutions directly involved in conducting research towards, for example, perception of Belarusian or Ukrainian diaspora, but we haven't come to that data. If we were to estimate, it would be probably around 1% of GDP or less. We also need to consider that the Belarusian diaspora is in Poland. There are approximately 300,000 Belarusians that have, for example, the Polish identification number in the identification system. So they account for some percent of GDP. And IT sector, we should aim at about 1%, but probably we need to double check it because we haven't focused on that, and that's actually a great question that could, for example, explain the policy measures or how to conduct policy towards Belarusians and Belarusian diaspora in Poland.
Yeah, I will just add that unfortunately we haven't verified this. It may be an issue we will consider in our upcoming article. However, several publications point to GDP growth in Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic countries, thanks to the migration of ICT specialists from Belarus. So maybe we will check this information and we will write this in our article.
Thank you, Jakub. Alexei, do you want to answer
Yeah.
the question?
Thank you for the question. So first, the first part, populism. In the United States, as far as I understand, again, don't quote me on that. I'm not a political scientist, but I think populism, the term populism does not bear, when Russians say populist, they think something negative, right? In the United States, it doesn't have a negative connotation. I personally, not because I live in the United States, but I personally don't find anything wrong with the term populist. I think any politician has to be a populist if he wants to come to power or she, right? So I personally don't think, I don't see how this concept of populism can replace the theory of charisma. Lukashenko did have charisma, let's be honest, when he came to power in '94. We can argue to what extent it was, constructed by the media, to what extent it was his personal appeal, but he did have charisma, a full charisma in the Max Weber sense. in 1994. That's why he won the election and he came to power. Secondly, in terms of this kind of 94 to 2020, all these changes, of course, I understand that this is like my lifetime. You know, the society changed between 94 and 20. It changed in Ukraine, it changed in Russia, it changed in Belarus. But from the perspective of, you know, Russian imperialism, and Moscow's imperialism that started, I don't know, with Ivan the Terrible, you know. So if we consider this 500 years, 26 years is nothing next to this 500. All I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to see how you can challenge that and what a person needs to have to challenge this this imperialism and this dominance of Moscow. So, and I'm trying to look at what these leaders have or had. In some cases, they're dead. So what they had that gave Kremlin the scare, at least, you know, and what you have to add to give them next time to give them an even bigger scare. That's all I'm trying to analyze. Thank you.
Okay. I'll give the floor to the man who is encouraging me to call a coffee break. But time for a question before that.
So the coffee break is 1:45 according to our calendar.
Yeah.
I have a question to Jakub and Jakub, and I don't know whether it's within your area of expertise or not. Can you see me, by the way? There, I'll stand. Yeah, so the question is, I was wondering whether you read anything about attitudes to Belarusians in Poland, because I see some conflicting publications on this topic. Sometimes I see studies showing that Belarusians are one of the top 3 least liked nations in Poland. Gypsies, Russians, and then Belarusians, followed by Jews and then as well. And then on the other hand, I personally, I've spent quite a lot of time in Poland, but I've never seen any prejudice or anything, any bad things told to me. Although when I speak Polish, I speak with a particular accent. At the same time, I hear more that there are too many Ukrainians. It's time for them to go probably. So I hear some anti-Ukrainian sentiments, and Belarusians whom I meet, they feel that sometimes they can be confused with Ukrainians, and this is why sort of they may feel uncomfortable. But when people understand that they're Belarusians, then it's maybe it's not the area of expertise. But have you heard anything about those studies, about their methodology, and will it make sense to you?
Thanks a lot for that question, which is really interesting and actually is closer to my area, since I've conducted some of the research on the perception of the national minorities, which included the perception of Belarusian minority, which is one of the national minorities that is accepted, that is enlisted in the Act on the National Ethnic Minorities. And while I was conducting the research, I've among young Polish people, Belarusians indeed were one of the least perceived nations. However, it is not due. However, I came upon one of the article that was explaining that Belarus, that low perception of Belarusians, a declared perception, is more probably a case of how the actions of Lukashenko's are perceived, rather than how the Belarusians are how the Belarusians act themselves. Poland was very supportive of Belarus and Belarusian opposition, especially after 2020, but also as a reaction of what the Lukashenko's authorities was the activities towards the Polish minority. You've probably heard of the releasing of Andrzej Poczobut a few days ago, which is one of the most highly regarded Polish minority activists. And even though that act was very highly regarded in Poland, we still perceive that who is governing Belarus and on which side the Belarusian authorities allied itself in the war with Ukraine. Obviously, the anti-Belarusian sentiments, I think they are not so present or might be present locally in the border area, so near Białystok or on the northeastern part of Poland, but it's probably very minor comparing to anti-Ukrainian sentiments where lots of historical factors come in. So I think that might be answer the question. Another research is the report of the Miroszewski Center on the perception of Belarusian diaspora. When that was conducted, I believe 3 years ago, and I believe 3 years ago, and one of the associations were connected with the Belarusian regime. But as I said earlier, probably the result of Belarusians being perceived as one of the least favorable nations is probably more a result of how Poles view Lukashenko than how do Poles view Belarusians themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub. Gentleman at the back.
Wait, it's interesting.
When the microphone is coming.
Hi, I'm Ethan Berger, and I'm sorry for my old speak, but I'll say something which, as an American or someone who's from the States, I don't concur, and I think it's important. I use the term populist as something which always is positive. Populist, aggressive, and all those things are labels, and they're all contextual. To me, a populist is one who offers simplistic solutions. I think of like progressive, for example, this progressivism, like in Wisconsin, in like 1910, and then people use the term progressive to slam people who in theory are on the left, like Bernie Sanders. I like Bernie Sanders, and I don't like some of the people who are labeled progressive. But anyway, all these terms are loaded, and so I always think that when you look at it, I'm a lawyer by background, but I'm really not a lawyer. But the first thing in the law is a definition section. And there's a reason why that is standard. And labels, they might be generally true, but just like all generalizations, they're generally true, which means they're not always true. So could you just respond to that?
Here's my talk. Let's do the search. I don't use this term. I never used this term. I never liked it. As I said, don't quote me on that. I don't use this term. Our colleague did. I don't use this term. I think it's, as you said, it's too loaded and it's too contextual. I totally agree with you. All I can say that I 100% agree with you. But from my observation, it's not 100% negative in the United States. In Russian, when you say populist, it's 100% negative. It's like that's my personal opinion, but as I said, I don't use this term. I never use it once. I was just responding to a question. Thank you.
We still have time for more questions.
Thank you for the great presentations. I'd like to ask one question to Jakub and Jakub. Could you briefly explain about the title of your presentation, The Duality of Belarus's Digital Transformation? I'm sorry, I couldn't 100% understood the duality means here. And also the status industry 4.0 strategy. Could you explain about this briefly?
So probably, I hope that my Jakub also will cover that later. So the duality that we were trying to show was that before 2020 and especially before 2022, the Belarusian IT sector was somewhat perceived as, and that's even one of the quote from one of the articles, an island of modernity that was in the country with, I believe, more Soviet style management, especially that perceived that represented by Lukashenko's administration. So we're trying to show that the duality was between the very prosperous and also very innovative and very innovative sector, which products were even represented and gained recognition worldwide. For example, the War of Tanks came, and the the activities of administration of the management that I might sound a bit too colloquial here, but could be perceived as a bit as not being associated directly with innovativeness. I hope if you have Jakub have something to add, please do it.
Yeah. I will try to explain quickly. A preliminary literature review showed us that on the one hand, the state is pushing a centralist top-down vision of industry 4.0, while on the other, the private sector, represented primarily by the IT and e-commerce industries, has undergone forced internationalization and relocation. This is a complete reversal of the situation, as the ICT sector has developed for years without state intervention. However, we will attempt to better explain this research problem in this article.
Any more questions in the room? There's still time to ask online as well. Gentleman at the back.
Distinguished guests, I wanted to ask, how do you see the future of Belarus? What mechanisms of constitutional measures and legitimacy could be adopted to prevent authoritarianism, populism, to get it kind of to develop in a similar way akin to the Western powers, more democratic culture? But if this is not possible, what are the remedies due to the historical and cultural circumstances of the region? Thank you. Sorry for the lengthy query.
Is this for me?
Yes.
Oh, for both? Oh, maybe I start?
You start.
Sorry, I'm struggling with this. Thank you for the question. I think Belarus is evolving or devolving or gravitating toward an even more. We no longer talk about authoritarianism. We're talking about dictatorial kind of type of elements of totalitarianism. So I think, in my personal view, to fight this, the only possible strategy is just what these people that I mentioned have shown us. that you have to have a personal charisma. You have to study what you need to do at the ideological level, at the practical level, in terms of economic program, etc., etc. And then you have to confront these monsters. So there's no other way. Nothing else will bring us closer to the demise of such very carefully and very meticulously constructed regimes as the incumbent regimes in countries like Russia or Belarus.
That's actually a tricky question because we need to, even if Lukashenka will will not be president anymore, I don't want to be precise how he will do it. It will not be so easy to get rid of or to minimize the Russian influence. The greater dependence that Russia tries to impose on Belarus, especially after 2020, had already made some damage, had already led to the loss of somewhat credibility. We need to remember that the Minsk process connected with the war in Donbass was led in Minsk because Belarus was viewed as a neutral state. It lost its status after 2020. It lost its status also with the practical Russification policy, or how the role of Russian's language increased. We also can observe that Russians are nowadays moving inside Belarus because ironically, they don't have, for example, the Telegram, for example. So one of the messenger apps isn't blocked in Belarus. And that also poses a challenge for European states, for example, especially for Poland and for the Baltics, where Belarusian diaspora is the biggest. I personally still do hope that there comes a day that Belarus will get out of the Soviets, of the Russian sphere of influence. We can see it in the case of, for example, Armenia, that it is slowly getting out. We had the European Political Community Summit in Yerevan this week. But it will be a very long way, which will involve the rebuilding of civic society, and also here is the chance for example, Poland and the European states and its soft power. It's the building of the soft power of the European Union that might actually counter and diminish the Russian influence. But that would also mean that the Belarusian identity would have to be rebuilt once more.
Yeah, I will just add a few words. We believe Belarus needs to revise its digital strategy as relying on technologies from Russia and China risk permanently degrading the sector and losing its competitiveness. Belarus and the West should open up to a common dialogue, but as we know, this isn't that simple. So host countries such as Poland or Lithuania or other country should implement programs aimed at fully integrating Belarusian IT capital into the European innovation ecosystem, which could significantly stimulate their own economic growth. A profound reform of the Belarusian education system is also necessary to the growing skills gap caused by the mass immigration of specialists. But this is a very difficult question, and what we have shown today in the preliminary results of our research may only have visible long-term consequences in many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakub. Can I ask you all to thank all the speakers again? And Jarek and Tatiana have something to say about the Journal of Belarusian Studies.
Tatiana, would you like to say a few words? I know you wanted to touch the network and also the reviews at in the Journal of Belarusian Studies. And also, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for letting me speak very briefly today. My name is Tatiana Stromska. I'm a historian, currently a research fellow, a visiting research fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, but I also work as a researcher at the Head Institute for Historical Research on East Central Europe in Germany, in Marburg. And I would like to speak very briefly about two important initiatives because we, of course, all of us are researchers, and the most important research is the most important things, writing, researching, presenting. But I would like to pay your attention to the scholarly communication, to networking, which is also a very important part of the work. And if we would like Belarusian studies to flourish, to be present, to be visible, then we have to also work also in this field. And so I would like to. So I'm serving from this last year. I'm serving as a book editor, a review book editor at the Journal of Belarusian Studies. And we would very much like to really revive and drive this field of book reviews, because I think this is very important to discuss our research, our work with each other, and to present it to the broader audience. And this is what we do also at the Journal of Belarusian Studies. We are going to publish more reviews, and we invite you to contribute. If you have something you would like to discuss, some recent scholarly work, but maybe even not so recent, and but just really kind of speaks to your field and to your field of interest, then please get in touch. We can discuss it. We can also order a book for you. And we will gladly publish it when you have read it, because I think this is what actually brings also our research forward and our field forward. And we are really working hard on, developing Belarusian studies and trying to make it more present in the global agenda. And then I'm going to share my screen very quickly. I'm going to talk also just a couple of minutes about our initiatives, which is called
Maybe 1 minute, because we have a coffee break.
Yeah, just 1 minute. Yeah, okay. So this is, can you see my screen?
Yes.
This is Age Belarus network, which was launched last year in September. And this is a part of bigger Age network. Of course, you know this is a huge network created in the early 1990s at the university. Now it's located at the University of Chicago, and this is basically a public history initiative, but also like initiative for communication between scholars. So we have Age Belarus now, and it is possible to join it as a subscriber, and then you will get all the information which has been published at the network. And this includes, for example, announcement about conferences, announcement about important publications. If you, for example, would like to create a panel, you can also publish announcement and people would approach you. And this includes also, so you can subscribe, but you can also become a member. And this means you can then also publish your own information if you have a conference and you would like to publicize also the results. For example, you can do this on Age Belarus, and we have already 200 members. We have also a Facebook group. So please have a look, join if you like. And we have also on Age Belarusian just recently created this new directory for where we collect information about researchers on Belarus. So you can also see who is doing what and connect with people, which is also important because really this collective work and collective effort is what is going to bring Belarusian studies forward. Okay, so I probably stop here. Do not want to take more of your time. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have questions, please Google my name and you will find my email and get in touch, or go directly to Age Belarus or to the editors on the website of the journals, a Journal of Belarusian Studies. Of course, you can also find my contacts. Thank you. It was great to be here.
Thank you, Tatiana. So now we have 15 minutes.